In the same decade, Minh Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese people, announced the struggle for independence from France and sent a letter to President Truman accordingly, requesting that the United States sponsor his country within the system of the UN Trusteeship Council. In return, he offered that once Vietnam had attained independence, the United States would be given access to one of the most important seaports in Southeast Asia. The Truman administration rejected this appeal. The Vietnamese won their independence from France in 1954, which the United States recognized. By then, the United States had already been involved in a war in Korea, camouflaged as a police action in June 1950 through 1953. At the beginning of the 60s, the United Nations officially declared that the new decade be known as the decade for the abolition of colonialism. Needless to say, the civil rights movement activists were not unaware of the declaration. Esanda Robeson, an anthropologist, was an honorary member of the Fourth Committee of the UN, known as the Decolonization Committee. She regularly wrote articles for the Pittsburgh Courier and other Black newspapers throughout the country on UN subjects. Civil rights activists applied this vision in a number of ways. And I want to point that are just chosen as examples of this kind of activity that was quite widespread. Diane Nash Bevel, a freedom rider for Nashville and member of SNCC, went with a small group of Quaker women to North Vietnam at the invitation of the Vietnamese to take note of the destruction of their country by the United States in the early 60s. Women for a Meaning, with Coretta Scott King, part of their delegation, sent a delegation to Geneva where President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were meeting. Great Britain, the peace movement, for several years held an annual Easter March for nuclear disarmament, a march to the nuclear weapons lab at Aldermaston. The US peace movement's annual spring mobilization, usually held in April, consists an American adaptation of what the British had done to protest the war mania. This event grew steadily each year during the 60s. In April 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King joined the annual peace demonstration a few days after delivering his historic Riverside Church speech, the full text of which was published in Freedom Ways magazine. The full text of published in Freedom Ways magazine also reached a French audience and other anti-colonials through the regular exchange that we had with the magazine Présence Africaine in Paris. The anti-war movement continued to grow and gather strength as the foreign policy accelerated this unjust war in Vietnam. Active participation included Women's Strike for Peace, the National Council, Clergy and Laity Concern, the American Indian Movement, District 65 in New York, Labor, and the Progressive National Baptist Convention, a predominantly Black organization of ministers from around the country. By 1969, an estimated 4 million people were engaged in the annual mobilization for peace as they began to, by 1969, an estimated 4 million people were engaged in this annual mobilization for peace, and they marched in 1969, not only to Washington, but in the cities in our own cities, rather than coming to Washington. The 1970s was a deep-seated opportunity that arose for very important anti- and pro-democracy demonstrations. This developed in the 1970s, and At the beginning of the decade, Jesse Jackson established Operation Push, People United to Serve Humanity, as a new element in the civil rights movement. And with a clearly defined foreign policy position, having established a foreign policy, a foreign affairs, international affairs department, the first among organizations. The growth of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and particularly the June 1976 Soweto Township massacre of children demanding good education, added a new dimension to the struggles for an end to war. The struggle for peace and the struggle to abolish racism was joined in solidarity. The very effective divestment program of the National Council of Churches against apartheid was development. The newly famed Congressional Black Caucus focused on stopping the lucrative sale of the Krugerrand in South Africa in the United States. Among the Black Caucus activities in the mid-70s was the issuance of a manifesto calling attention to America's relations with the South African apartheid regime. The document was co-signed by several civil rights organizations which were represented on the committee. Our movement responded actively to the 1977 Portuguese Spring in Lisbon, which celebrated the end of fascism in Portugal and the independence of the former Portuguese colonies of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. A large delegation from the United States went to Lisbon to share this event and meet the representatives of the former colonial countries, as well as people from around the world. This movement was General Costa Gomes of Portugal was the new president. A decade later, we would learn how once again the United States and apartheid South Africa collaborated, this time in financing armed revolt against the governments of the newly liberated nations, Angola, and the South African government supported Mozambique. You see this shaping of foreign policy around the effort to turn the clock back on the various liberation struggles in Africa. At the end of the decade of the 70s, the issue of the Middle East and the Palestinians in U.S. foreign policy gained considerable momentum. In 1979, at the request of the Association of Arab American University graduates, my wife Jane and I, a delegation of civil rights activists, to visit Beirut, Lebanon, and meet with the PLO. This delegation included Susanna Cepeda, co-chair of St. Freeze, Reverend B.W. Smith from Buffalo of the National Baptist Convention, and later president of the Progressive Baptist Convention, Tom Porter, chair of Black Studies Department at Ohio State University, Al Gaskins of the National Conference of Black Law, Mrs. Jacqueline Jackson, the wife of President of PUSH, Joel Kugelmaas, executive director of the Pacifico Radio Network, and several others. We met with Chairman Arafat and other PLO officials in Beirut and visited Tyre and Sidon in South Lebanon. On returning to the U.S., we arranged to meet with Ambassador at the UN, Young, to share some of what we had learned about the situation of the Palestinians and the role of Henry Kissinger's current no-talk policy in perpetuating their flight. By the autumn of 1979, 350 ministers from many denominations attended a conference on South Africa and the whole effort to isolate that racist society, held it at the UN Church Center in New York. The meeting was co-chaired by Wyatt Walker, former chief of staff for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Akatini, the director of international affairs of the African National Congress. The central message of their commitment to support disinvestment from South Africa by churches and other groups. And the following year, participants in the entire annual convention of PUSH in Chicago marched on the South African consulate on Michigan Avenue, demanding that it be closed. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a manifesto also and later held hearings in the Middle East. The 1980s brought forward developments of significance in our discussion of anti-war, anti-racist internationalism. In their order of occurrence, the Nation magazine tour of NATO countries of Western Europe in 1981, of which I was a member of that delegation, to observe the widespread protest against President Reagan's unilateral deployment of nuclear cruise and Pershing Europe, especially the European countries, in the European countries of Western Europe. The largest anti-war demonstration in the history of the United States, June 12, 1982 in New York, was organized in which 800,000 people filled Sheep's Meadow in Central Park. You all remember that? You don't. 1982 in New York, and people in Sheep's Meadow, Central Park, while another 100,000 people were left outside and in the various avenues leading from the United Nations Center through up to Fifth Avenue. This was a historic demonstration that established that a large strata of the people of the United States wanted peace, and that Reagan's precipitous actions that didn't even have support for most of the people in Western Europe was something that we were determined to oppose. The two presidential campaigns of Jesse Jackson in 1984 and 88 placed the issues of racism, war, and poverty front and center and international in scope, as he as a presidential candidate visited both Cuba and Nicaragua and brought forward the in the platform committee of the Democratic Party. Women disarmament groups, Catholic University, in this trip that we made to the cities of to the countries of Western Europe, the NATO countries, one of the comments that I wanted to call attention to, and that is the Catholic University in Holland. When we visited there, one of the women said to us, the Nazis came in 1940 and left in 1945. The Americans came in 1945. When are you leaving? The delegations of African Americans from Chicago to the meeting of the Not Aligned Conference in Zimbabwe in 1987, one of those very important developments in terms of the commitment and growing understanding of the relationships in the world that were taking place. We had a very sizable delegation from Chicago, made of many local businessmen, people who helped finance the apparel. In other words, the connectedness of these events in one decade represents a high water mark in the peace, justice, and anti-colonial movement's efforts to change the nation's foreign policy. And so we see that there are many opportunities open that we open by virtue of our activity to guarantee that the justice and peace is able to go forward. For in the last analysis, that is the future of our country. That is the future of the world. Peace is our common humanity's highest expression. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Odell. Barbara Ransby?
How are you all doing this afternoon? Good, good, good. They didn't tell me when I said yes to this that I have to follow Jack Odell. Humbling. Okay, I want to thank again the organizers of this wonderful event. It's been very stimulating and inspiring in a lot of ways and thought-provoking. Of course, Christina Heatherton and Jordan Camp, Ruthie Gilmore, and all the unnamed staff who helped to get us here and make sure we've eaten and been taken care of. I'm really honored to be on this panel with Jack Odell and Nikhil Singh. I was asked to talk about the past and the present. That is, my work on the past and some of my work in the present. Now, let me say a little bit to begin about why I think this conversation on a Black radical internationalism is so important at this historical juncture. Some of this has been said by other speakers, but I think it bears repeating. Because Black radical internationalism stands in juxtaposition to a new conservative Black nationalism, which is patriarchal, pro-capitalist, and pro-militarist. Now, by this, I don't mean the old school Black nationalism. I don't mean a call for a separate Black nation per se, but I mean the attempt to rally Black people to American patriotism. Remember the scenes in 2008 at Obama's inauguration. I had never seen so many Black people waving so many American flags in my life. It was totally unsettling. But they were not waving those flags the way people did in the 1950s and 60s to really shame America about the hypocrisy of its policy vis-a-vis people of color. But they were waving the flags as a certain symbol of racial triumph. Now, fortunately, I think most people have sobered up since then, and if they were not convinced that the current president was not going to deliver us to the promised land, I think most people are pretty convinced by now. I'm a historian, so I think we have to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about racial capitalism at this moment? What does it tell us about racial capitalism that the outward face of US empire today is a Black face? We have more people in power and on the world stage and more Black people in prison and in poverty than ever before. I could quote the wonderfully eloquent Ruthie Gilmore by saying a Black man in the White House and more people, more Black men than ever before in the big house. But it is not only Black bodies and Black faces representing US empire. From Colin Powell selling the United Nations on the fact that weapons, the fact, in quotes, that weapons of mass destruction were the reason for the US invasion of Iraq, to Susan Rice, when she was ambassador to the UN, insisting to an audience that she quite proudly spent a great amount of her time, I'll quote her, "We spent an enormous amount of time defending Israel's right to defend itself and defending its legitimacy throughout the UN system." And she saw this as a fine allocation of her time. That says a lot. But it is not only this. It is also the ways in which both racial and gender narratives are deployed in the service of war and empire. Back to the US invasion of Afghanistan, the narrative, of course, was a part of the narrative was the justification for that intervention was to save, as one of our colleagues has said, brown women from brown men. The backwardness and misogyny of the Taliban was the justification for UN intervention. And if we were confused about that, the RAWA, the Revolutionary Afghani Women's Alliance, spoke to this, saying that Afghan women's freedom from the clutch of both fundamentalism and occupation and patriarchy is possible only through their own struggle. But again, we saw in the words of humanitarian hawks like Sarah Power that a bemoaning of the lack of US military intervention in the genocide in Rwanda. Now, it's a complicated question, but I think most of us would agree that the US military has never been a force for liberation and freedom anywhere. Most recently, I was actually at a community meeting in Chicago at the height of the mainstream media's publicity about the kidnapped Nigerian girls, and people were actually insisting we needed to have boots on the ground to defeat Boko Haram and rescue our girls. Now, these arguments on the world stage remind me of the same kind of arguments that we hear in communities about the need for cops in prisons, that only cops in prisons can solve local problems, and only guns and drones can solve international ones, and this is a fundamental logic that we have to reject. The good news is that there is growing agitation, organization around racial capitalism, against the new Black nationalism, and linking it very powerfully to issues of race and gender and sexuality. Now, back to the past. The work we do today stands within a tradition. One, as Ruthie Gilmore rightly said, is constantly being made and remade. It is being made through the repression and reclamation of memory, and through the recuperative process of excavating buried archives and stories. I can just say as an aside, I was very happy to hear Francoise talk about gender this morning. Women's stories are indeed there. They simply need to be excavated. What I also want to say is that gender and sexuality are variables in the male-centered narratives we recount, even when women's bodies are not present. But where we look and what questions we ask are key, as is the case of Esanda Cardozo Good Robeson. Essie Robeson's story is a story that largely has gone unnoticed, in part because in the large we have leaders, particularly her political contributions as well as her intellectual contributions, have withered in the shadow of a larger-than-life partner. I can't tell you how many times that I began discussions of my project on Esanda Robeson only to be talking about Paul Robeson in less than 2 minutes. So we are missing many stories because the women are literally overshadowed by the men with whom they work, struggle, and live. So why is Esanda Robeson's story important? Most people know her because of her marriage to Paul Robeson, but there is another story to tell. Esanda Robeson visited colonial Africa in 1936 and 1946, and then again to an independent Ghana in 1958. She did so without her husband. She went to the front lines of the Spanish Civil War in 1938 alongside Paul to take a stand against fascism. She traveled through Nazi Germany during World War She was in 1945. She visited Mao's China a few months after the revolution in 1941. She stood up to, defiantly, Senator Joe McCarthy's committee in 1953. She wrote or co-wrote 3 books and visited over 50 countries in the course of her life. Other reasons I think her story is significant. Essie Robeson and Paul Robeson were unapologetically on the left and allied with the world communist movement during the Cold War. This was dangerous business. In some ways, they were both blacklisted in life and have been blacklisted in history. I see the telling of Essie Robeson's story as a recuperative process to bring her back into the larger narrative of a Black radical internationalist tradition. Also, the way in which Esanda Robeson did her work in the world is important. She did not have the approach of saving the third world or bringing her skills and insights to people of Africa and other parts of what we now call the global South. Rather, she located her own intellectual roots in her connections with and in the learning situation she found herself in alongside Africans. For over 40 years, Essie Robeson navigated a complex marriage as she navigated the cities of Europe and the villages of Africa. Along the way, she saw history in the making: emergent fascism, eroding colonialism, and embryonic socialism, and the disintegration of empires. Working over 20 years as a freelance journalist for as a United Nations correspondent and writer, analyzing international affairs and domestic politics, she wrote literally hundreds of essays and articles and delivered hundreds more speeches and lectures throughout the US and the world. She was unapologetically on the left, rooted in a commitment to African people, and concerned with the voice and plight of women. As I mentioned, the first place of Essie Robeson's internationalist awakening was with the African diaspora. It was 1932 in Paris. That is, her engagement with Africa came about through a circuitous route. She and Paul had been living in London from 1927 to 1939, and in 1932, their marriage was going through a difficult time. They managed to get back on track, but she'd actually gone to Paris to seek evidence for a divorce. But while she was there, she found much more than the evidence she was looking for. Her escort, confidant, and constant companion that summer was a Dahomean activist, Kojo Tuvalu Hoinu. How many people have heard of him? Okay, it's always a small number. Of course, Robin. You have. Robeson to a group of African writers, artists, and thinkers who were in Paris at that time. One was Habib Benglia. Habib was a dancer and a performer from West French Sudan, and his dream was of a global Black dance theater that would perform on both sides of the Atlantic. He was bold and irreverent, to say the least. He told Essie in one of her interviews with him, "The only troubles Africa has are the sickness, the beasts, and the white man. And the white man is all three," he says. Another woman who she met during her time was a lively Martinican writer, Paulette Nardal, who some people may be familiar with. She also spent time with Ada Bricktop Smith. I'm reminded of the conversation yesterday with Tulani Davis about artists and the role of artists in circuits of emancipation. Ada Bricktop Smith was a complicated person, but she had a club in Montmartre, and she became a kind of confidant of Essie's that summer. So in a sense, from the time of this trip to Paris until the end of the decade, Esanda was really on a journey to find her political voice. Soon after, she had this experience in Paris, about which she wrote actually in Dorothy West's magazine Challenge. She enrolled in the London School of Economics, and there she met Jomo Kenyatta. She was actually the person that introduced Jomo Kenyatta to Paul Robeson. He was very influential in her thinking. Esanda wrote about Kenyatta. She says, "Before I met Kenyatta, I was studying anthropology and Africa. However, Kenyatta brought it to life for me. He took me out of the textbook into African life itself, and of course made her want to travel there." In 1936, her physical journey to Africa began. And it was an ominous moment, of course. It was 1936, and Italy had invaded Ethiopia, and this was the backdrop to her first trip to Africa. She went for several months. She went by ship to South Africa and then to Uganda. She had gone on this research trip at the urging of Zora Neale Hurston. This trip had a powerful impact on her. When she was in South Africa, she visited the famous Robeson Deep mines. She went on a surreptitious visit one day when the overseer of the mine was not there. She actually descended into the mines and talked to and interviewed the miners. She met some of the future leaders of the South African freedom movement, leaders of the ANC, Alfred B. Zuma and Z.K. Matthews. Z.K. Matthews, who would later be a part of the famous treason trial of 1956 with Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu. She was also able to attend a historic conference in 1936, the All-African National Convention in Bloemfontein. This was in what was then Orange Free State. It was a historic gathering of anti-colonial leaders from all over the country, and she made a special point of meeting with a women's group that was a part of the conference and gathered great insights from that. So that's, again, part of that hidden transcript, if you will, a part of an archive that has not been unearthed. We don't have a transcript of what happened at that meeting with the women, but we do have her recollection of that. And we know that women saw it important to talk specifically about gender issues and the experiences of women in that context. Essie was very inspired politically and intellectually about her exchanges in the dusty villages and ramshackle dwellings of Southern Africa. She was humbled by that experience. In a quote from her journal, she kept a very extensive diary during her time there. And again, rather than seeing herself as bringing knowledge from her studies, she really saw herself as a student of people engaged in struggle on the ground in Southern Africa. Big talk, challenging ideas, enthralling discussions. The walls of our world moved outward, and we caught a glimpse of things in the large. As I sat and listened to these Africans, these so-called primitives, they made me feel humble and respectful. I blush with shame for the mental picture some of my fellow Negroes in America have about Africa and Africans," end quote. In 1946, she made her second trip to sub-Saharan Africa, this time visiting the Congo, on what was a pretty precarious journey. And there's her journal documents, sort of getting on very small airplanes and having to leave some of her belongings along the way because she was on smaller and more fragile aircraft as she went further and further into the interior of the country. She did a number of interviews on that trip. One of the people she interviewed, interestingly, was Moise Tshombe in 1946, who would later be, of course, implicated in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. She did not know that at the time, obviously, and maybe neither did he. But she was engaging and interacting with people who would be really important historical actors later. That same year, she published a book called African Journey, which was the chronicle of her diaries on her 1936 trip a decade before. She dedicated that book to the brothers and sisters in her growing political family. You know who you are. So, I got my pages mixed up here. Great, okay. So Esanda Robeson began her internationalist work as a part of an African diaspora and very much grounded in the anti-colonial movement in Africa. But it didn't stop there. She particularly had close ties to Asian activists, Indian activists. In the late 1930s and early 40s, she met and befriended Jawaharlal Nehru and his sister, Vijayalakshmi Pandit. In the process, they became lifelong friends. In fact, in the 1930s, when Vijayalakshmi Pandit's daughters were studying in the United States and their mother was in jail in India for her anti-colonial activities, they stayed at the Robesons' home on weekends and considered Essie a surrogate parent. Essie developed a very personal relationship with Jawaharlal Nehru. They exchanged long and personal correspondence over many years. She mailed him a copy of Richard Wright's book, Native Son, and a report issued by the National Negro Congress. Essie's relationships were extensive, and I think in some ways her political internationalism was really grounded in a network of relationships. From Chetty and Janet Jagan in Guyana, to diplomats she had met in China, to activists she had met during the Spanish Civil War who became exiles in Mexico, to correspondence she maintained with Kwame Nkrumah. Women were prominent in this group of correspondents. Her anti-colonial sentiments were mostly expressed through her writings and speeches, but she did participate in a number of organizations. She was, of course, eventually asked to join the Council on African Affairs, but two women's organizations, I think, are significant in terms of her sense of connections with women in the Global South and Third World. She joined an organization, she was one of the founders actually of an organization called Sojourners for Truth and Justice in 1951. My colleague Eric McDuffie has written about that. Shirley Graham Du Bois, Louise Thompson Patterson. Louise was here earlier. I don't know if Mary's here, so very much still present. Bea Richards and Carlotta Bass. And they expressed outrage and protest over instances of racism and sexism toward women in this country, but also solidarity with women in South Africa. Another organization she co-founded in 1961 with communist exile Claudia Jones was the All African Women's Freedom Movement, founded in London at Unity House. And this was an attempt to bring women together around a radical Pan-Africanist vision. If anyone doubted the seriousness of Essie Robeson's internationalist work, if observers did or historians do, the fact that she had such an extensive FBI file and also was followed by the British internal security, the MI5, which is the British internal security, MI6 is the handles foreign relations, but since she was living in Britain at the time, she was followed by MI5 when she traveled through Africa. And I was going to read you an excerpt, I'll skip over it. But one of the reports from the agent that was following her was, insisting that she was a very serious customer with very strong radical ideas. She dared to think that Africans should be ruled by their brethren. So this was her example of her strange and far-fetched ideas. Esanda Robeson participated in a number of organizations, as I said. The 1958 All Africa People's Congress in Accra, Ghana, was a particular high point for her. Her friend Shirley Graham Du Bois was there. The two of them walked arm in arm into the first gathering of that convening with Kwame Nkrumah. Patrice Lumumba was in the audience. So let me just shift to my conclusion, which is to say, I feel that Essie Robeson's story really is only the tip of the iceberg of not only women's stories, but the stories that help us get a handle on not only racial capitalism, but the ways in which gender and patriarchy are implicated in it. I always think of biography, it's a very personal genre, and I always think of what can I take away, not just as a historian and a storyteller, but also as an activist. What have I taken away from my research on Esanda Robeson? Of course, history is not a blueprint, but Esanda Robeson talked and wrote about struggles in places that others chose to ignore. And I have to remind us at this moment that we cannot forget Haiti, which has not been in the news as much as it should and should be very much on our minds. She rallied around unpopular struggles as a matter of principle, and we have to insist on not being bullied into silence around the issue of Palestine. She understood the connections between US oppression and anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism elsewhere in the world, and in that sense, we have to be concerned about the shanty towns that still exist outside Johannesburg, and the prisons with and without walls, and the occupied communities here and elsewhere. Finally, for Esanda, black was a political color, a color dividing the haves and have-nots, the imperialists and the victims of imperialism, the bullies and the freedom fighters. Today, there are a number of activists carrying on in Essie Robeson's fine tradition. I think I was really struck by Ruthie Gilmore's insistence that the Black radical international tradition is constantly being made and remade. So today, many of us who have made a commitment to speak out and organize around the issue of Palestine as a matter of principle are doing that and attempting to make and remake the Black radical tradition through expressions of solidarity. And that is determined not only by the fact that some of us have gone on delegations, but how we've gone. The delegation that I went on with Gina Dent, Angela Davis, and Rabab al-Duhadi and others in 2011 was explicitly looking at the connections between the United States as having its origins in settler colonialism and Palestine and the reality of settler colonialism there, the occupation there and the occupation here. I also want to hold up the work of some amazing young people who have really been doing the work of intersectional politics, have been doing radical internationalist work in ways that I find quite awe-inspiring. A number of young people just came back from Geneva, Switzerland, confronting the US government about its treatment of Black and brown youth and communities of color from Ferguson to Chicago. They were a part of something called the We Charge Genocide Delegation, and you can find out more about them on wechargegenocide.org. But they are not only standing up to racial capitalism, they are also standing up to US empire, to patriarchy and homophobia. One of the things that the Black Youth Project 100, one of the groups involved, says as its mantra is, we're ready, we're coming. And they're coming not only to confront capitalism, but again, patriarchy, homophobia, and to confront elitist and top-down forms of undemocratic leadership, which I think is something we also have to face up to if we're going to have the kind of liberatory movement that will sustain a different kind of world. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Nikhil Pasing.
Thank Thank you. I want to thank everyone very quickly. I'm mindful of the time. Thank you, Ruthie, Christina, Jordan. It's kind of, it's a little overwhelming and quite inspiring to be in a room with so many of my intellectual idols and inspirations. Not the least of which is Jack O'Dell, and you can see why I had to interview Jack O'Dell for almost 5 years, because he has so much to recount, and the only thing that's worse than going after Jack O'Dell is going after Jack O'Dell and Barbara Ransby. So I'm going to frame my remarks today in terms of these three kind of concepts: racial capitalism, internationalism, and permanent war. And I'm going to be a little schematic, and I'm going to try to cut a little bit on the fly because I'm mindful of the time and I want us to have some chance to talk. So I'm thinking today about the question of internationalism and transnationalism from a largely U.S. standpoint and in the context of the post-World War II period, as I tend to do in my work. And as I will argue, this period might be thought of as the proper conjuncture for a decisive reconfiguration of racial capitalism with which we are still contending. The post-World War II period is one in which the valences of internationalism shift as capitalist elites within the world's dominant nation states turn decisively away from nationalism, while organized labor becomes embedded within national welfarist compacts hinged to the global expansion of dominant regions of capitalist power, above all in the United States, but also Western Europe and Japan, and to an extent even the Soviet Union, although that's more of a debatable point for us perhaps. It's interesting to consider that this period, one marked by the first sustained coordinated effort to manage racial capitalism on a global scale, is also the period in which racial capitalism decides to simply call itself capitalism. Put differently, to represent itself as global at this moment, the global hierarchies of wealth and power and politics that had been framed, legitimated, legalized, and institutionalized over several centuries as preeminently racial hierarchies were either recoded by other names, no longer talked about in polite company, in limited ways reformed, and of course also subject to an increasingly coherent, mass-based radical challenge. From the standpoint of the dominant recoding, however, the discourse changes in many different ways. Race development, for example, becomes simply development. Western civilization becomes simply civilization. The yellow peril becomes the red menace. Formal equality comes to mean scrubbing racial reference from law and language. And anti-racism becomes a forensics of exposure in which racism is reduced to a special category of offense and a wrong to be righted so that business as usual can proceed on a more secure basis. This is really a quite stunning transformation, and I'm obviously condensing and telescoping here to be sure. I mean, just as an aside, as many of you might know, this sort of anecdote that Robert Vitalis has written about, the journal Foreign Affairs, which is the journal of record still in international relations in the United States, in some ways in the dominant capitalist world, its precursor was the Journal of Race Development. So the Journal of Race Development changed its name to Foreign Affairs in 1922, which is also the moment of the Washington Naval Conference, which really establishes, according to Adam Tooze's recent work, the kind of basis for U.S. global hegemony in the coming period. And we can see these different kinds of markers kind of going back through time. I mean, I'm thinking about the post-World War II period, but obviously these kinds of transitions are layered and they don't happen all at once. But there's something going on in which the unmarking of race as a category is important to this moment. And I think we actually have to try to grapple with that. And many of us have, and many of us have written about this in different ways, but I think it still presents a conundrum for us, one that tends to leave us in a kind of endless looping conversation in which we are forced to constantly rediscover what we already knew. Let us take the important example of the relationship between capitalism and slavery. It is no coincidence that Eric Williams' 1944 text inaugurates the period, in some ways, in which racial capitalism decides to simply call itself capitalism. Indeed, Williams clearly identified this very problem, and as a result was subject to the entire weight of professional historiographical denunciation, refutation, and discrediting, a project that intentionally papered over the germinal idea with so many layers of dross that it became very difficult to recover. And I don't seek to redeem Williams here. He needs no such redemption from me. But beneath the technical disputes about slavery, profits, and industrialization, or mechanical Marxist debates about wage labor and the mode of production, a new generation of historians, recently heralded in the New York Times, which is not in any way meant to detract from the richness of their contribution, has arrived back at Williams' central point. And the point, as I take it, and here I remain, as ever, indebted to Cedric Robinson's wonderful essay on Williams, which, to echo a previous speaker, if you haven't read it, you should acquaint yourself with it. One of many in the archive of rich occasional essays that Cedric Robinson has written throughout his own remarkable intellectual career, that slavery became the, quote, convenient foil for the expansion of freedom, defined in limited and subordinating terms as market freedom and the wage contract, obscuring how capitalism was fully indebted not only to the profits of slavery, but its infrastructures, and we might add, following Ruthie Gilmore, its infrastructures of feeling, accounting, insurance, actuarial science, double-entry bookkeeping, and incipient conceptions of human capital and biopolitical depreciation. Williams thus expressly sought to undermine liberal historicism that increasingly cast enduring racial inequalities as the vestiges of a prior era now embodied in the habits and dispositions of the black poor, and to show how assertions of progressivism on slavery, much like the racial progressivism of the 1940s and beyond, was becoming securely hinged to the legitimation and expansion of capitalist state powers and new racial orderings of exploitation and hierarchy. And I'm quoting Williams here just so you don't misunderstand what I'm saying. This is Williams. This does not invalidate the arguments for democracy, for freedom now, or for freedom after the war, any more than it invalidated the struggles against slavery. But mutatis mutandis, he continued, the arguments have a familiar ring. We have to be on our guard, not only against the old prejudices, but against the new, which are being constantly created. So the problem we face in arriving back at what we once knew is that we do so at a moment in which racial capitalism arguably has less and less need to conceal its true face anymore, and which, facing multiple terminal crises, is likely to be tempted again toward final solutions. At the very least, the promise of turning segmented race development into a generalized development is no longer even on offer, and the holism that capitalism once embraced against its communist challengers has now returned to a far more open avowal of partition, separatism, and racism once more. It bears saying in this context that there has never been a successful movement that has represented the dispossessed classes in their entirety and in the fullness of their heterogeneity. Though the communism of the Third International sought the negation of capitalism, it did not seek the negation of racial capitalism, at least not in its full measure, and thus abdicated or remained at least ambivalent on a fundamental point. After World War II, the movements of the darker peoples, in turn, were largely tethered to the fortunes of the darker and soon-to-be poorer nations that were gradually forced to cede the international scale to the sovereignty of capital itself. Where these struggles were articulated with anti-racist struggles, a broader internationalism of peoples was broached, particularly around the Vietnam War and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and perhaps today incipiently in the struggle for justice for Palestine. But the goals of radical movements remain largely limited by nationalist horizons, even as capitalism itself now fully transcended them. And I'm not saying the nation state's not important to capitalism, just to be clear. Within the United States, the democratic upsurge of African Americans, which was part of this overall decolonizing imperative, similarly resulted not in the general democratization that its most far-seeing visionaries like Jack Odell and others sought, but new forms of racial bifurcation in which a limited diversification of the elite marked the outer limit rather than the non-racial extension of national welfarist and social democratic forms, and subsequently a sharp return to divisive racialist themes in which the punishment of the poor, black, and migrant became a prelude to a more general neoliberal unraveling. The latter has produced a trajectory in which dissimilarities of position among the urban working poor across the world, the vast majority of people on the planet, are gradually diminishing, though in a context in which the prior collapse of radical and labor internationalisms has left us wanting for strategic vision, effective coordination, and holistic imagination. What we are up against has also not stood still. The war for capitalism is still being fought. That is, the war for differential advantage and primitive accumulation, or what we might call relative and absolute surplus value. Once fought in the name of imperialism, colonialism, and racialism, such terms became temporary liabilities, but the project did not fundamentally change. How am I doing?
Doing great.
Okay, so that was just a kind of a slick pause to obscure the gap in my paper. Just kidding. Okay, so the broad project of American capitalism, I would argue, in some ways, has been to reduce to the greatest extent possible the space between money and decision. It is easy to see how violence becomes the primary modality or instrumentality of this reduction, and hence very close to money itself. That is not to say that the promise of this reduction, that is, the reduction of the space between money and decision, is not in some sense held out to all people, at smaller and smaller scales, of course. But it also means that those who seek to occupy or linger in this space in ways that disrupt the equation, that is, those who seek the power of decision without money, are to be dealt with severely. It also means that the history of the accumulation of money remains always closely intertwined with the private life of power, understood as the command of others in racial, gendered, and sexualized terms. Put differently, we might say that the US throughout the post-war period, and for much longer, in fact, has attempted to establish military power as the permanent appendage of or supplement to the universalization of capitalist accumulation, exchange, and governance across the planet. Anti-communism was the rubric for this project in the 3 decades following World War II, and though it was presented as a defensive strategy to forestall the imperial designs of Soviet communism, it was in fact its own imperial program of positive expansion, that is, the securing and development of capitalist property relations on ever more expanded scales. In this sense, American planners both knew and did not know, and still do not know in some ways, what they are fighting against in the course of expansion. That is, they didn't simply misconstrue the anti-colonial nationalism that sometimes took the name communism. They were also unwilling to risk the possibility that those parts of the world deemed essential for the functioning of the whole might pursue their own autonomous or self-directed paths of development, including capitalist paths that did not comport with the US model or variety of capitalism on offer. In this context, it is possible to further refine our understanding of American militarism as an economistic rather than strictly economic orientation integral to US capitalism, a recurrent projection of force and violence in the name of freedom, and not only or even primarily in the name of security. In this way, we can also better understand, I think, how the classical antitheses of American freedom, that is slavery and savagery, have been retained as powerful pretexts and durable cultural templates for war making into the 21st century, ones limed or subtended by an illimitable source of infrahuman racial beings who are alternatively the objects of contempt and erasure, or pity and salvation. So I want to linger briefly on the question of the relationship between race, war, or we might even say race, war, and police power. For if capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it, as Ruthie put it last night, then we might also say that war is the primary modality and instrument of its accomplishment. And when we look at inceptive liberal thinking about the establishment of government by consent, which of course is said to be the primary US gift to the world, we find that the theorization of the state of war within the state of nature plays a central role in thinking about how to establish all sorts of relations at a societal level up to the level of international relations that at once secure private property, but do so in terms of an international division of humanity. And I'm really thinking here back to the work of Locke primarily, in the second treatise, which I'm sure many of you have read, in which really there are two moves, and one I think we're more familiar with, the move in which just war becomes the mode of land appropriation in the so-called terra nullius, but also in the redemption of so-called waste spaces, but also wild spaces that are inhabited by men whom he says we can never have any men who are like animals who we can never have any peace or security. So that's the native question, and that's the question of settlement via erasure and contempt and a kind of violence that has been fundamentally resistant to any kind of decolonization wherever it has occurred. But the second move within Locke is the elaboration of what he called, or what has been called war slavery doctrine, which is that the other thing that happens in the state, the other aspect of what happens in the state of nature is that in a state of war that occurs in a state of nature, it is acceptable to seize captives and instead of killing them, enslave them. And so war slavery becomes a mechanism for imagining the possibility of a slavery that can exist kind of beneath the level of civil order. So of course Locke is writing the Constitution of the Carolinas, and he's invested in the slave trade, and he's helping to imagine schemes of settlement from the British Isles, what will become the British Isles in Northern Ireland, to the Americas. But I think that these two dimensions of kind of slavery and settlement, and I think in thinking about them in terms of war, need to always really be thought together, okay? But they need to be understood in the separate trajectories that they end up having historically. Because the thing about slavery, in part at least, is that it is a humanizing discourse. It's a humanitarian discourse in a sense. Instead of being killed, people are being made captive, and therefore also being brought into the purview of civilization and a possible future in which they can be somehow redeemed even as sort of subordinated figures. And I think that's the logic of racial slavery that then sort of wends its way through a kind of an American discourse that says we are here to, for example, liberate the captives, from their various kinds of oppressors. And it's a discourse of pity and salvation. But the other side of the discourse of American war making has always been the discourse of fighting savages, which ultimately requires scorched earth and extermination. And they actually exist kind of papered together in certain kinds of ways, and they can be called upon in different ways when needed and as needed. So I think it's actually important in this moment especially to bring back these conversations into the same frame, and to remember that when we're talking about racial capitalism, we're not just talking about racial slavery, but we were never, when talking about racial slavery, just talking about slavery. We're also always talking about settlement, because we were always in some sense talking about war. And about the conjunction between race and war, and the way in which war is the battlefront that runs through, as Foucault says, the entire edifice of what we think of as civil society. And really, there's a whole tradition in radical thinking for these ideas, from Angela Davis, importantly, and Ruthie Gilmore in this room, all the way through the thinking of Foucault and Gramsci and others. But I think that this has some potential, at least analytically, for helping us to think about what we're dealing with in this contemporary moment, where the face of American power is a face that is supposed to represent a kind of redemption redemption from the stigma of slavery. Okay, American capitalism, and here I'm wrapping up in my final couple of paragraphs. Learned its chops on the frontier and in the slave market, as well as in the factory and the corporation. Its primitive modes of accumulation in the theft of land and compulsion to labor were renewed and rendered temporary by the Cold War's globalization of manifest destiny. That moment when Truman's investment prospectus, as Dean Acheson called it, was infused with the moralism of a crusade and the vitalism of a civilizing mission. And that Cold War script has been scratched over and recopied many times since then. For developing an optic adequate to understanding the post-war structuring of power in these terms, what Cedric Robinson has termed the Black radical tradition remains a central touchstone, not out of any sort of romantic fidelity or nostalgia, but because it attempted what to date stands as the fullest effort at sabotaging the twin engines of dishonor and dispossession that still drive the racial capitalist machine. Last paragraph, I promise. The long Black freedom movement provided us with the principal dialectical counterpoints to the wasteful and destructive American half-century. It did so not only by vanquishing the criminal order of Jim Crow, but by illuminating the history of dehumanization embedded within modern political economy, proposing an alternative ethics based upon compassion rather than fear in social interactions among heterogeneous people, and by demanding a departure from imperialist arrogance and colonial violence in the relationship of the United States to the non-European world. Among the most important intellectual legacies it bequeathed began with the vision of abolition democracy, a sharpening of politically productive antagonism between Black aspirations for freedom and prevailing discourses of American freedom that time and again made peace with the opponents of those aspirations. As we broach these questions again in an age in which capitalism itself embraces an apocalyptic future for the many, the imperative to reach out, reconstruct, and reimagine the broadest and most generous future grows more and not less urgent. In the spirit of acknowledging the generous and generative contributions of Cedric Robinson these couple of days, we might say that only confronting racial capitalism will do. Thank you.
Well, now I have the extremely unenviable task of speaking after all three of them. I'm just going to ask a question, and while I'm doing it, you can slowly move to the microphones and think about your own questions. But I was really struck that... Is he still there? Hi, Jack. I was really struck by the fact that this discussion of anti-racist internationalism was one of not just interpretation, but also rediscovery. I think all the panelists in one way or another gestured to the fact that we're talking about histories that are occluded, blacklisted, or recoded, so that, as Nikhil said, we are often rediscovering what we already knew. And I was struck by the recodings that Nikhil was talking about, racial development being recoded as development, Western civilization as civilization, freedom as market freedom. Oh, he can't hear. Okay, hold that thought. Jack, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask the panel if they could talk about a more contemporary recoding that I think is relevant to this conversation, and that's a recoding of capitalism itself as neoliberalism, which by many accounts often appears as something that David Harvey invented and Naomi Klein seems to have discovered. I don't know if you know that you invented it, David, but that seems to be the consensus. So I'm just curious if the panel can comment on how this specific reinscription, I think often a kind of antiseptic reinscription, not by you, David, by others, of capitalism as neoliberalism has impaired, slowed down, or reinterred this history of anti-racist internationalism and the kind of ideological production that it's produced. So that's my question. Jack, can you hear us here? Be like a backup group. Jack, did you hear the question?
No, I didn't completely hear it. I heard her say something.
Okay, we'll have Nikhil and Barbara try to answer the question and and like I said, if you have questions, you can go ahead and come forward. Why don't you go ahead and take a seat? Sure, okay, all right.
We'll make a note of this.
So everybody's thinking. So Jack, we're going to take some questions from the audience. So again, if you have questions, please raise your hands or come to the microphone. Look, is the audience dodging my question too? Can you all just come to the mic? I know people are thinking about things.
So my question relates to food. I was thinking about what Francois was saying in the morning panel about what's happening right now with the promotion of monocultures is like a war on the poor. And so I've been thinking about permanent war and just in my own research, looking at how food is so implicated in the expansion of racial capitalism and also military interventions as well. So just wondering if you could address that a little bit. And it's also interesting because recently I heard a speaker who was sort of instrumental in bringing the Green Revolution to India and who I think is very much implicated in current efforts to support sort of GM crops and that whatnot in India. He said the future belongs to nations with grains, not guns. And I was thinking, actually, it's grains and guns, because if you look at agriculture and military, these are two huge areas of speculation and profit making. So I would just wonder, and also just in terms of like humanitarian interventions, whether military or, you know, for saving people in the global south. So wondering if you could address that a little bit.
Jack, were you able to hear that question?
No, I didn't hear.
Okay, I'll try to rephrase it while the panel tries to answer.
You raised a similar question in the earlier panel. I thought, you know, was really an important intervention that Francoise made in talking about issues of environmental justice writ large, but embodied within that, I think, the politics of food and the right of people to survive. And I think of it in an urban context in that, you know, the food justice, and we actually hosted Naomi Klein recently, which was interesting. And I actually think the new book has some important things to say about this. But, you know, the movement around food justice in some ways has marginalized folks in urban contexts who are living under a certain kind of occupation which prevents the procurement of food in a very fundamental way. And I think we have to both expand in the way that, you know, a number of people have argued around green economies and thinking of incorporating any kind of economic solution to any kind of green solution or green policies to economic justice demands in the communities that are so direly affected. But also looking at the agency of people who are demanding access to food in communities like Chicago and Detroit, where Sassi Assassin has this new book about expulsion, that we think of surplus people, and surplus people you don't have to account for in a whole variety of ways. And I think the denial of access to not just healthy food, but any food is increasingly where we are in certain communities, and that's criminalizing survival then when people make certain kinds of interventions in order to eat. And so it's not just a question of community gardens, which in some ways accompany gentrification in certain communities and becomes a very complex kind of political negotiation, but simply the access to food. And I think, increasingly it's useful to talk about the ways in which survival has been criminalized, particularly in urban communities.
Yes,
Go ahead, Jack.
oh, yeah, yes. I think that that's a very, very important observation. And one of the things that we projected in the Freedom Charter was the idea of outlines of an economy of full employment at socially useful work. This idea of food is an integral part of the larger question of what kind of democracy we see. I mean, obviously, we want people to be able to eat healthy food, just like we want them to have education and health care and live in an environment free of terror and homelessness. So it seems to me that these particularities are part of a larger whole that has to be constructed. And we have to work on the particularities, but at the same time try to fashion a larger frame of reference in terms of the quality of life that we seek for all. I mean, I think that's the fundamental thing. That's the long-term proposition that should guide our activity.
I'm trying to think about how to answer these two immense questions in a kind of concise, helpful way. One of the things that I think this is this statistic is correct. I think the one I'm going to say, which I think that the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, is the world's single largest employer. I think it employs about 3.2 million people around the world, and we know that in all the planning that goes on now in the U.S. military, almost, I would say, 80% of it is articulated in terms of humanitarian projects. Disaster relief, famine, climate challenges of various kinds, and a lot of the sort of large scale planning around that really is about what to do with civilian life, because civilian life is itself a problem. And in a manual that I read recently, the argument basically goes, civilians will be competing for all the same supply routes and pathways to resources that the military will need to accomplish its mission. So just think about the kind of way that works, really. In order to save civilians in general from these various calamities, civilians actually have to be either detained or sort of removed or sort of placed to the side so that the military can actually gobble up the kinds of resources it needs. And these are the kinds of visions that are sort of out there, right, as a kind of adjunct to disaster capitalism and to the kinds of crises that it's facing. And they go alongside with the fantasies that among the very rich and not just the very rich, that they will somehow be able to produce a kind of vertical distance from all of this. That they can continue to fly over, they can continue to have things brought into them in sort of safe zones. And to me, that kind of mapping or that kind of effort to sort of think about the world we live in right now is really more useful and specific than say, the invocation of a term like neoliberalism, because clearly there's been a tremendous mutation in the way in which capitalist societies organize themselves. And I think many people have written extremely helpfully about that. I do think maybe what you were going for, Christina, is the idea that to talk about neoliberalism somehow sort of just naturalizes this sort of idea that all we ever have is a certain kind of horizon that we can really never think beyond, whereas at least in the argument about capitalism, which has always, to my mind, been informed by its dialectical opposition, the idea is that capitalism holds the sort of seeds of its own undoing in some sense. It's not just this kind of project that is just kind of tinkered with all the time in various sorts of ways. So, I mean, I find a lot useful in the literature on neoliberalism, but I don't necessarily think it's the most interesting way to talk about what Ruthie calls the anti-state state, or to sort of describe the kind of geographies of, the new geographies of partition, which actually have become much more supple and flexible and movable in the current moment. And all of this sort of begs to me the most important question, which is, I think, what I was trying to gesture at to some degree in my remarks, which is, how do we think about the scaling up of our own oppositional projects once more? And I'm tremendously struck by Barbara's remarks, and especially Jack's remarks, at just the depth and the density of movements aware of the international scale and thinking through how to articulate struggles against militarism, struggles against colonialism, and struggles against racism in the preceding period. And we don't seem to have that kind of density or that kind of ambition in our own sphere of activity right now. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about how to redevelop. And we'll always be redeveloping, we'll always be reinventing our tradition. And so that's not the problem, but we have to do it.
I'll defer. I actually have a question to raise, but I see there are two people at the mic, so I'll incorporate my question into a response.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all your presentations. They were fantastic. The questions about kind of liberalism and racial capitalism and internationalism, because in each of your papers, with Jack's comments and with Nikhil's, you take on the ways in which, particularly the Truman administration, inaugurates this kind of era of permanent war. And in Barbara's comments, she talks about the challenges of a Black radical internationalist tradition in the age of Obama, the kind of celebratory nationalism that we've seen. So if you could think about the kind of, out loud with us, the challenges and opportunities of internationalism in reckoning with liberalism on one hand, in the face of this resurgent kind of revanchist right-wing bloc that has won these elections in recent weeks, and help us think through how we might confront, this nexus in the current conjuncture.
I also wanted to echo the excellent remarks. I believe the question that I have is for Nikhil, and it speaks to, I think, a fundamental issue for me, and that is how you confront racial capitalism when it seems that much of our political language, particularly those of us who are stuck in the Western Academy, stems from a lot of the theoretical contributions of a John Locke, of a Thomas Hobbes, of these people who not are only responsible for the development of modern society, but their work actually sets the premise for modernity itself. So how do we confront racial capitalism when it seems our political language, the tools that we use in the academy, seems to be compromised?
Poets in the room. Yeah. Well, I mean, I do have kind of a response to both of those. I directed it toward Nikhil, and I'm sure he'll have a really deep answer in a minute. But, I was thinking as Jordan was asking his question, what are the sites of struggle at this juncture? And two things that I've been wrestling with, and it represents a very ambivalent shift in my own political practice, is taking electoral politics a little bit more seriously than I have in the past, and particularly on the local level. We almost had a very progressive mayoral candidate in Chicago who I had said I would work with, and I've actually never done that before. It was Karen Lewis, the head of the fierce and fighting Chicago Teachers Union that led an amazing strike recently and was poised to use a campaign as a strategy for movement building. So that's one thing, so placehold that. The other is really thinking more seriously about the work we do in the academy. I think for many years I saw my political life as wholly outside of, and the less my employer knew about my political activity, the better. And I'm still quite ambivalent about how to negotiate that, and a group of us are rereading Fred Moten's article about the undercommons, the article that led to the book about the undercommons, and really wondering, how do we understand the role that universities play today, particularly in promoting and defending racial capitalism? And Ruthie has written about this a little bit, the diversity industry, the multiculturalism industry, that in a sense it sounds like the opening up of the university. It feels like the concession to the demands for inclusion, but their inclusion on certain terms, going to the brother's point about language, that you have to speak a certain language and you have to operate within a certain logic in order to A, get in, and B, stay in and not be totally out of your mind, but sometimes stay in and be out of your mind. But to really look more seriously at the sustaining and validating and cover work that happens within universities, and particularly within the departments that many of us who see ourselves as radical occupy, the interdisciplinary departments that people fought to come into the university. And Cedric was interviewed not long ago talking about Black studies and the evolution of Black studies away from sites of struggle and connection to struggle, but also now really being places where we don't recognize the stories that are told, we don't understand the theories that are formulated, and dare one be uncivil, as my would-be colleague Stephen Salida was in tweeting about Palestine. He was tweeting as Palestinian and was basically denied his job because he stepped out of a certain kind of civil discourse, not even on campus, that is in his public life, in his civic life, away from his job. He tweeted things that the university deemed anti-Israeli and uncivil, and that became the language for excluding him from the academy. So anyway, I'm just raising, that's my question response, that here we are in an academic setting. I've always had this healthy or unhealthy ambivalence about my life in the academy, and really no more so than these days. But I would be interested to hear what other people also think about how to reconcile that contradiction. Can we only be criminal in the academy, which is how Fred Moten starts that particular article that I'm thinking of? Can we only steal to and become a sort of, community of refugees in a way to do the work, that is to be of and, be in and not of? So I raise that as, I think, a really important question. It's the site where a lot of the language and data is generated that supports and dresses up and gives a facelift to racial capitalism in some of its most brutal forms, and I'm sad to say. And how are we complicit in that? Can Jack hear us?
Yeah.
Oh, you can, okay. I didn't know if these were working or.
Well, I think we all always have to search out and listen for the language that people use every day to express their problems and situation they are under and are going through. And on the basis of the use, that's one of the great advantages of listening well. You can talk well, but you got to learn to listen well too. Because when we listen well, we see how the way in which people are expressing their concerns that are the concerns that we have also. And I think that basically this idea of creating the language that is the most easy for most people in their experiences to understand. However scientific we might be, we have to break it down, so to speak, in such a way that people understand what we're saying and therefore are making their input, because their input is as valuable in the creating of the ideas that we want to put forward. Their input into it, based upon the way they put it, is an important ingredient. We create science out of being able to listen well and interpret that which we have heard, so that it touches people. Say, oh, that's exactly what I mean. And that's exactly what I mean. And it's,
I know we're sort of at time almost, but I'll just say one last brief thing, which is, yeah, I think these are very important questions, and I think we wrestle with them every day. And those of us in universities who are, I think, consumed at a certain stage of our career with administering the university and kind of helping it to continue to go, and or have our time and our souls just kind of sucked up by that kind of activity. Are confronting something specific about the neoliberal moment, which is really part of how it works, is just by keeping us too busy to do anything, to actually take the time, to take back the time that we actually need to have long discussions about things, and to really linger and listen, as Jack's saying, and to learn what we need to learn, or to relearn what we already knew. And I think that's a really, really challenging thing. And since I moved back to New York from Seattle, I know I found that to be really quite dramatic. I mean, I feel like I'm always being time managed, and I'm always time managing others. Okay, I've got 10 minutes. I'm time managing right now, right? I've got to. It's a real challenge that I think we have to think about very seriously, how we take back the time that we need to do this work, and give ourselves the time and give ourselves permission to take the time. In terms of the university, I think the university, I don't think we have to just be criminals. I mean, in Fred's terms, I think we can do what we all try to do, is to make the boundaries of these institutions, which are becoming more fixed and more impenetrable, more porous, more available, more leaky, how to reappropriate them, reimagine the spaces we inhabit as sites of linkage and sites of solidarity. And I think all of us try to do those kinds of work. These are some of the spaces we have that are really quite vital in this moment. I mean, the Grad Center, I meant to say at the beginning, I mean, it's just such a key institution of our city, and a place where we can do this work. And if we really start doing it well, and having the impacts that we want to have, we will have more pressure coming down on us. We'll have more hell raining down on us. Of course we will. But that's what we want, ultimately. That's where we want to go. And in terms of, the master's tools and the master's house, I mean, I think there's much to the argument that the master's tools can't dismantle the master's house. But I will say they sure can help.
So on the last point about time is probably a good place to end. But I do want to add that, as Danny Widener said earlier, winning time for spaces of leisure, for spaces of thought, for spaces of organization has been a victory of working class movements, and our lack of time, time needs to be a site of struggle for the present and the future. We appreciate all of you taking your time this Friday afternoon to be a part of this conversation. We hope that you will join us for the final plenary of Confronting Racial Capitalism, which will happen tonight at 6:30 at the NYU Global Center, which is located at 238 Thompson Street. It'll be at the C95 Lecture Hall. It's on the program. Please take a program if you haven't already. Please join me in thanking the panelists, and thank you for being a wonderful audience.
Jack.
Bye, Jack.
Bye, Jack. Can everybody say bye, Jack?
Thanks for joining us, Jack.
Thanks so much, Jack. That was fantastic.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. I thank you for
We'll be in
inviting
touch
me.
soon, okay?
We'll be talking soon.
Thanks to Jane and thanks to Karen.
Oh, you're welcome.
Here's James.
Thank you, Christina. It's
Hi, Jane.
wonderful
Good to see
listening.
you. We'll have to talk soon.
Yeah, we will.
Okay. Take care now.
Oh, I did know. Yeah, right.
Thank you guys so much.
You gave us such a big question.
I know. That was a tough one. Thanks, then. I hope you're happy.
Hey, thanks for coming. Hey. Oh, thanks. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Good job, Christina. That was. Well, yeah, well, it's Sunday. I'm going to be in DC. I came last night. It was good. I know you have a better thing. I wanted to.
Don't leave yet. Don't
I
leave
want to make
yet.
sure I introduce myself.
Yeah.
Josh Myers.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're here. Or you're in
I'm
Columbia.
at Howard.
You're at
Howard.
Howard. Okay.
Yeah, with
Oh,
Greg.
okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Will you tell Greg I said hello?
Okay, I will.
In history.
I will. African American studies.
African American. Okay.
We have missed each other, but we have a lot of connections.
Right.
I also work with Muhammad Ahmed.
I'm not good at it for myself.
myself, but I recognize it. I know what you said.
That's good. Are you around for the rest of this?
Yeah, I'll be here.
Okay, good, good.
Yeah.
So are you still there? They said that.
Robeson, want to make sure I shake your hand too. Josh Myers.
I mean, I want that. You just spoke to me.
Should I get back?
I don't know if I can come tonight. I would really love to continue this. I've also been really involved with it. So I don't know if I can make it, but I'm gonna try. Do we?
Finally met.
Were you part of that too?
I just like wrote a book ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was really good to be done. I have to say that. And he'll say, which I never believed, the whole like legitimation of the PhD thing. So I was like, hey, you can impress people with this job. I just don't know. It was bizarrely not related. Like I met the guy who already got like, but I did. Like it was Philly activist training program. So that's what I've done for like 2 decades. So that's a big part of it. For sure. But it's like, oh, you're a doctor. You'll be my professor. You'll be the professor for the movement. Like it was very like the legitimation of it in that sphere.
Well, internationally, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's more about class formations, which are different in North America than
Where it's like
yeah. Well, because things are in flux, but I think that was precisely. So you are working towards oh, it's actually like the social capital. These benefits is not what it was, and it's not what it would yeah, no, of course. Yeah.
I have a former student. I've been modeling to Philly. She moved to Philly. She's actually one of the best students I've ever had, and she's just so political and aware. And she's I would say food and environmental justice, but
My people, my stuff.
yeah,
Your question.
Right.
I was there. I was with you.
And she came to me and said, "I want to get involved in some."
Yeah, it's just always the question always is
More than that, just because we were in Philly for like 3 months. Do you have anyone that I could contact?
Tell her to email me.
Can I give her your email?
Please, yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if I
have
had to
it.
always say. This is my full-time jam, and that's a decent wage for me.
No, I mean, even amongst the region.
And then I also work with movement support stuff, facilitation, consulting. So I sometimes do my food justice stuff through this.
What I was able to direct you
But I'm in Philly, particularly doing all of like
That's what I was
food policy.
thinking.
But I'm on the Mayor's Food Policy Advisory Council. We're meeting on Wednesday.
Oh my
You're still been involved in a lot of like food policy stuff, but like broader.
Yeah, I feel like she emailed me and said, "Can you give me a
Oh, yeah,
no,
yeah.
she didn't.
Right, totally, yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Do you happen to know like the queer realm is Yeah, like, I mean, literally, like, have her email me and tell me which neighborhood she's living in. Which will help, because then I'll just link her up with some cool stuff. In fact, one of the things we're trying to do right now is organize a screening Cuban documentary film. Actually, Ryan Van Hamilton's going to organize the New York.
Congratulations. How are you?
I just linked to my Yeah, it will be. So I'm going to be probably helping to organize the but it's interesting. It's about the hydroponical, like organic.
Yeah,
like,
well, they I looked at it.
Sustainable.
Semester at least.
It's
Still
like
waiting to see about screening.
immediately outside of Havana, and just sort of like getting all the food.
sounds incredible, yeah.
So that could be something. Yeah, there's like so much happening.
Yeah, I will have her.
Yeah. How are things going with your?
It's a great act, actually. We're good. I think so, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, you've like laughed at me. Well,
Yeah, were you working?
no. I was like ABD like 2 years ago, and then took a leave, and I'm getting that info and taking basically withdrawing. Yeah. I got busy. It's good. I didn't feel like I wasted my time at all. I use this mouse like all the time. It's huge. So yeah. And I'm not like writing a song.
No, do you need it?
Oh, no.
I'm gonna go to wait for Amanda. We're gonna
Do you need help
Said I'm using
schlepping?
all the analysis, and I know I would
Do you need help schlepping?
I think we'll be okay.
Okay, because I'll be up there in a couple minutes.
Okay.
Just like you guys change.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was yeah, and what?
So I did all the paperwork. They stopped issuing them.
I'm not trying to skip out of it. No, I didn't mean it. Oh, no, I know. Yes.
Yeah, she's 3.5.
I thought you were at the coast thing. I was like, no.
Yeah.
No, I know.
That's crazy.
Just get to figure out,
Yeah.
So is she like in
She's in preschool, a cooperative preschool. It's like, pedagogically, like, kid-centered and whatever.
When are you
stuff.
leaving?
She's up here at the People's Climate Fund. We stayed in
Basically, I can do
Greenpoint.
whatever.
Yeah.
Because my
and that would also maybe change since it's a monument.
Well, for us also, it's like, it relates to all this stuff around like, just like divine and the devolution of so like for us,
or you can just come up to
we don't have, they've dismantled the public schools. We got out of get out of jail free card. During Friends School, which was actually just rated the #1 school in the state. Really?
But then she would have known it was 15 years ago.
Okay, yeah, please. And so it means that
Congratulations.
so if I were to like do something, just like
Well,
no,
the thing is, this,
I haven't just like
I'm so grateful you're going to be here because you get
to it's not like that would be the place where I was saying that, but I'm like, oh, I can tell my kid, it's wonderful.
And besides that, like,
it's not.
I'm
Professor Ramsey, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming and speaking.
Thank you so much. What's your name?
My name's Brian Kova. I'm working on a project about grad student working on human Harrison. Yeah, so
Where are you?
I'm in Oxford, but I'm here doing research, in the office here on the project. So I just wanted to thank you for your work, and it's been very helpful for me because I think part of what you're doing is sort of re-excavating some of the things, like Ella Baker, like who've been sort of pushed aside, gosh, Harrison, I think, is in that camp, and nobody really knows about it. This is someone who I think needs more attention. So yeah, it's great to
Do you
learn.
have a little card with your, or email me? Sure. People who are at the early stages of research, I'd like to recruit them unless you're ready.
Okay.
I don't know how far along you are.
Yeah, you mean like do an article?
Yeah. Then it's in a year, that's fine too.
Yeah, it'd probably be another year or so before I would have something.
Yeah, but I
back.
want to get you on my radar.
Okay, so
All right.
I'll email you then.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Okay, nice to meet you too.
Cool. Absolutely, yeah. I'm excited to be in touch.
was cheap.
Yes. And everybody is very cool. Yes, he is.
Oh, right on.
He is. He's doing well. He has some like recent PTSD. It's so interesting. He goes to the VA. So he's in the service. So they diagnose him with PTSD. It's sort of like, well, yeah, of course, we go to the VA. Right? So but I was talking to him. I grew up on a farm in Mississippi. Then you were running the Department of Justice. School desegregation.
Yeah, I noticed.
Alabama, Mississippi. Then you were a judge in Baltimore. Your whole life is being constantly surrounded by danger. If you didn't have anxiety, there would be something the matter with you. So it's so no, he's well. He's good.
I told the story something giving my book talk, that PTSD.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And then somebody asked about, well, what about judges and what about alternatives?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
He's wonderful.
No,
guys finished around here, right?
Yeah, I was double checking we didn't leave anything.
Don't worry about it, because I just need to be working around the state before we just put it down for the next event.
Okay, I hope we're not messing you up.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Appreciate your help, man.
Of course.
Doesn't need to be there.